This is a production of Cornell University.
So I had intended to start off with what I thought was going to be a provocative set of remarks to get everybody fired up, but in light of the discussions, maybe they're not as provocative as I had hoped. But I want to sort of make the following claim just to sort of frame things, and I think it's consistent with some of what we've already talked about, that if we look back over the last 100 years of social science, what we see, and I'll try to be more specific about this in a second, is that if you pick any sort of area of interest, we have a tremendous number of theories, lots and lots and lots of theories, and yet when we try to see how all these theories fit together, there's no sort of sense in which they form a cohesive, cumulative, empirically relevant body of knowledge. So I want to just make that claim, and I think that there are some narrow exceptions to this claim, and I think that we think about sort of mechanism design in economics applied to ad auctions or something. You could say, well, we actually are figuring that out when making sort of sustained progress, and we can apply that to real applications. But these are pretty artificial, pretty limited settings. I know, 6 years ago, or 8 years ago, Russell made the claim that that economics had sort of reached the stage that I don't know if you remember making this claim, but 100 years ago, you were, it was sort of like if you were sick, going to the doctor was sort of like half the time that was a good idea and half the time that was a bad idea. So the beginning of the 20th century is sort of roughly the sort of point where we went from like medicine being sort of actively harmful to your health to medicine being a good thing that you could rely upon to make you better. And then he made the claim that sort of economics had sort of, or macroeconomics at least, had kind of reached that stage where if you had an economic problem, you were like, roughly speaking, better off going to talk to an economist about it than not going to talk to an economist about it. 2 years later, maybe people would have changed their minds about that. There was a lot of sort of patting on the back of macro econ that is now sort of seems a little premature. But maybe there's maybe that's still true for econ. I think it's generally not true for most of social science. So we do have some exceptions that I think we can look to. Nudging is something that has kind of moved into the government realm, and I think maybe there are some success stories that they could claim. I think if you look at the Poverty Action Lab up at MIT, they might say, no, we're actually figuring out how to apply economics to real world problems. But I think in general, it's true that social science has done relatively little to inform social practice, and we can sort of go over lots and lots of examples in advertising, in organizational performance, in conflict resolution, opinion change, building social platforms. The kinds of questions that non-social scientists come to social scientists and say, "Can you help me solve this problem?" The answer is almost always no. Okay. So I'll just give you a more specific example, but I think maybe I don't need to belabor this too much. Again, if we look at this particular field of organizational performance, which is something that I've been sort of burying myself in recently, there's a nice paper back in 1984 by Miner sort of does a survey of the field of organization science, and he identifies 110 distinct theories. I mean, this is sort of crazy, right? I mean, it seems normal to us because of course that's true in social science, but you step back and you think that doesn't make any sense. How can there be 110 distinct theories about the same thing? And it's sort of, even kind of different bodies of theory that in some sense don't even bother to speak to each other are all supposedly talking about the same thing. And so of course there's no sort of generalizable principles. There's nothing that all agree, like this is what we think about organizations, right? There's no sense in which that agreement exists. There's also, and as a result, you can't sort of take what have organization scientists, learned that I can apply in practice, right? If you go ask one of them, maybe they'll tell you something, but if you ask 15 of them, then you're just confused, okay? So, I'm often in the position of being the only person who even sort of is partly a social scientist in the room, and computer scientists and engineers and physicists and others will sort of say to me like, what does social science have to say about this? And I'm sort of always just kind of dumbfounded because I think, well, I don't know, like hundreds of different things, but there's not one thing. Like there's no thing that we can say. And this I think is a real problem because, and we sort of see this in this particular field of organization science, sort of repeated calls to sort of fix this state of affairs. And then, 30 years later, there's another paper that says, oh, it's still a mess, like nothing has changed, we need to do something about it. So I think that we can, pick any field that is of general interest, collective action, diffusion, systemic risk, epidemics, government, whatever you pick, you see roughly the same deliberative democracy, you see roughly the same state of affairs. And it even as bad as the level of very specific models, right? So one of my favorite examples, many years ago I was sort of reading a lot about diffusion models, and two of the most prominent models in this area, one from sociology and one from economics, Granovetter's threshold model from the late 1970s, and Binchandani's and Hirschleifer's model from the early 90s. And you read these papers, and they're, superficially, they're about the same thing. Like they invoke all the same sort of stylized facts and examples of, crowd behavior and fads and financial markets. But then when you look at the models themselves, they actually are theoretically incompatible. They make assumptions that cannot be mapped into each other. Like it is not possible, it's possible for both of these models to be false. It's not possible for both of them to be true, okay? So, and yet, what I found so sort of stunning about this is not only that this problem hadn't been resolved, but nobody seemed to have even noticed it, right? Instead, these sort of models just get tossed out into the sort of, world, and they just sort of sit there, and some people read one and find it interesting, and other people read another and find it interesting, and at no point has anybody sort of said, okay, let's try to test these things against evidence and see how they hold up. So this sort of situation just kind of persists for decades, and it sort of makes me wonder, like, what are we doing? If this can happen, like, what are we actually doing? And again, like there's lots and lots of examples of this. I mean, another one in the sort of trade literature is, lots and lots of people have read Freakonomics, okay? Which proposes a particular way of a particular theory of behavior, like, basically sort of rationality, that the incentives matter, right? Like everything can be explained in terms of economic incentives, right? Predictably Irrational, also a massive bestseller, says everything can be explained except in terms of incentives, right? I mean, there's a completely opposite points of view about how to explain human behavior. Millions of people have read both of these books, right? I would propose that if you read both of these books, you should be confused. Like you should not know what to think, and yet nobody seems confused. They just read these books and then that's it, But they're like, it doesn't make sense, right? Okay, so how do we sort of think about what we can do differently now? If this has been true for 100 years, is there any hope at all? And I would say, of course, I think there is hope. And I think one reason for being hopeful is that we're finally starting to get the kind of data that one can use to subject some of these models and theories to empirical scrutiny. But we're getting to the stage where we don't have to tolerate this situation if there's just lots of models out there and we have no way to decide which ones we prefer. We can actually start to test them against data. And you're all familiar with these examples, so I won't really go into them. Another interesting thing that's happening is that it's not just that we can use this technology to shed light on old questions, but that the technology is actually generating new questions as well. And so there's some sort of urgency and motivation to think about what is happening in labor markets, for example. Like labor, the nature of work is changing, the nature of organizations are changing because technology is effectively reducing transaction costs and reducing search costs. And this has all kinds of interesting implications, not just for how we can produce things and how we can solve problems, but also implications for distribution of wealth and inequality and all kinds of social and labor outcomes. So I think there's there's new possibilities and there's also new urgencies around that have been driven by technology. But I think that it's important not to get too excited, and there's a lot of excitement, a lot of hype maybe around computational social science and network science and big data, and you read about these topics, and there's many conferences and research centers popping up all over the place. It seems every week I learn about some new center for computational social science or a program in computational social science, and computer scientists are getting interested and physicists are getting interested, and this is great. But I think that a lot of it is kind of skirting many of the questions that when you think about the social world, we think are important. Nothing that has happened in the last 15 years of network science helped us understand the buildup of systemic risk in the financial system. There's all these models out there, they're not really none of them are really speaking to the actual problems that we need to solve. None of them have informed the Dodd-Frank Act, right? Nobody went and said, okay, what does network science tell us about how to fix systemic risk in the financial system? So in some sense, it's still the same story, that we've got a lot of chatter, a lot of proposing of theories and writing papers, but no actual solving of real problems. And this, I think, this even applies to very straightforward questions. I mean, it's hard to explain to a non-social scientist that we don't know the answer to this question. Why do people change their minds when they do? It seems like the very first thing that social science, and it in fact was one of the first things that social scientists thought about, right? And a couple of hundred years later, we're still asking ourselves this question. We still don't know. Again, we know lots and lots of things about this, but we don't know the answer to this, right? So I have some ideas about how we can think about progress that we can make over the next reasonable period of time, let's say the next decade. There's some very concrete steps that I think we can take as a field and as institutionally to close the gap between what is happening right now and what we would like to see happening. I'll try to go through these quickly because we could talk about them later. Certainly I think as much data as there is out there, and I've worked for the last 7 years in Yahoo and Microsoft, and people assume, oh, you're in this kind of data, nirvana, where all this data is just kind of flowing from the faucets, and you don't really have to do any work. But actually, it's incredibly frustrating, right? I mean, it's so hard for us to even get the data that you think of an interesting question, you don't have the data for that question, okay? Someone else has that data. And all of this data is kind of siloed in different companies. It's incredibly hard to bridge these gaps. It's very, very difficult for us to share data across organizational boundaries. And so, one thought is how do we bring data of these different modes together? Somebody has network data, somebody has communication data, somebody has e-commerce data, somebody else has search data. You might think that you would learn something much deeper about the nature of social reality if these different types of data could be brought together. We have no mechanism for how to do that right now. Another problem that I think is actually getting worse is that a lot of these platforms are increasingly algorithmically driven, right? So when you go to Facebook, what you see on Facebook is not some unfiltered representation of what your friends are doing and saying and talking about. It's a very curated version that Facebook itself is actively putting together. So what you're seeing is Facebook's theory about what they think you're interested in, okay? And this is becoming, so they're actively interfering in the process of people communicating with each other. And they're doing this because this improves user experience, right? It's good for them and it's good for their advertising and it's good for all of their agenda to do this. But it completely messes with the data itself. It sort of almost, it's getting to the point now where I wonder if Facebook is even sort of useful for doing social science, because it's so sort of confounded by stuff that's in this black box that, you know, even the people who manage the NewsRank algorithm, they don't know how it works, right? It's so complicated, right? So this sort of, I think, is starting to be more of a problem. And so maybe, and this is something that, you know, Matt's Organic has frequently sort of reminded me of. Maybe the solution is we have to go and collect our own data. That we, you know, it's sort of, on the one hand, it seems like, oh great, we should just use Twitter, we should use Facebook, we should use all these things that are already out there. But actually, maybe the answer is we should not use those things, and we should go design our own research collection. Another thing that we're working on very actively right now is taking this idea of the virtual lab and scaling it up. So we can, you know, Siri is sitting at the back there, and we've done a bunch of interesting experiments over the last several years where we can bring, you know, sort of roughly speaking, up to sort of 30 people together in a virtual environment and have them perform some sort of experiment where we can change the network in the background or other kinds of incentive structures. You know, if we could do that with 30,000 people at the same time, that would be, it would sort of qualitatively change the kinds of questions that we would be able to ask. Oops, what did I just do? Another limitation is that we're really sort of, everything we've done so far has been on the desktop, which means you have to kind of have people sitting there interacting with each other, actively engaged in something. There's sort of a limit to how long you can do that for. You know, currently we can keep people around for about an hour. After that, it gets really hard. But you could imagine, you know, once you put things on phones, right? So people are just now playing this game or whatever it is in their natural environment on their way to work, at home. You know, everything can be completely asynchronous. It's possible then to imagine experiments that run for days or months. Okay, so again, you can sort of expand your mind about the potential research designs. And of course, smartphones are also just loaded with sensors, you know, accelerometers, altimeters, cameras, so GPS, they know where you are. You can interact with other people while you're carrying your phone. You can touch phones together these days. So there's sort of an amazing, I think, proliferation awaiting of research designs that we can, where we can think about sort of large-scale experiments. But I want to sort of now touch on this point that has already come up about interdisciplinarity. And I think that in some sense, interdisciplinarity I think is super important, and we have to think about how to do that because we have these sort of, in some cases, profound differences between in cultures between disciplines, and you know we're sort of, it's bad enough within the social sciences, but you know computer science is like an alien planet, right? I mean, it's it really they're so different in terms of their publication schedules, and you know they don't publish in journals, they publish in peer-reviewed conferences. So you know you wouldn't even know how to read a CV for a computer scientist, right? You just be like, oh, there are no real publications on this, you know. But a computer scientist has a totally different sort of mental map of the world, and you know they know which conferences are top conferences, and they have their own way of parsing CVs. You know, graduate students come out of their PhDs with 20 publications, right? This would be unheard of in a sociology department. So there's sort of very different sort of value systems. It's hard to get computer scientists to sort of work on a project for 2 years because they get sort of nervous after 3 months that they haven't published a paper yet, right? I mean, things move much, much faster. But I think that an even deeper problem is not the between discipline problem, it's the within discipline methodological differences, right? That even just within sociology, right? We have mathematical sociologists, who use agent-based models. We have experimentalists who do lab experiments. We have quantitative sociologists who do statistical modeling of observational data. We have theorists. We have ethnographers. None of these people talk to each other, right? I mean, they all sort of work on the same problems, right? again, take organizations. All of these different methods have been applied to think about organizations, but no one's research design is interacting with anybody else's research design. So I think a fundamental problem that we have to crack is this notion of integrated research designs, that what I do in the lab should be driven by the output of your agent-based model, and the output of that should inform the field experiment that somebody else is running, and the output of the field experiment should be informing the subsequent ethnographic study that tries to understand what was going on under the layer. And then all of that sort of wraps around back into the next sort of generation of agent-based models, right? So there's sort of, I mean, that actually is sort of just the scientific method. It's like a very simple idea, but it's extremely hard for us to pull it off when we're so focused on the output, the unit of production being the academic journal article. And as Peyton already mentioned, Preston is my colleague at Microsoft. Peyton already mentioned, there's a huge problem here of incentives. That we're sort of all currently incentivized to publish those 5 papers in A journals, and that's how you get tenure, and that's all you care about, really. And as John also mentioned, the people who go and try to solve real-world problems are often pretty low status. And I actually think that's what we should be trying to change. We shouldn't just accept that. So I want to finish with this. I was up at Cornell on Wednesday with Steve, and it was the 50th anniversary of the computer science department. So it was a great event. Bill Gates was there opening the building, and Gates Hall, and there were all these fantastic talks from luminaries of the Cornell Computer Science Department, many of whom were graduates. And so I was really struck by this one talk by Daniela Roos, who is the chair of the robotics department at MIT, and she's a Cornell alum. And she was talking about this robot project that she's been working on with her graduate students, where they've built a robot that can bake a cake. I mean, not very well. Like, it's a pretty lousy cake, and they have to do all kinds of, they have to like prepare everything for the robot, and it does these sort of weird motions where it slams the spatula into the thing, and so everyone's watching these videos, and it's just, it's hilarious and everything, but it's pretty awesome, right? There's a robot making a cake, right? And then after the talk, I thought, why the hell are they building a robot to bake a cake? Like, if I think about, like, what are the problems that the world is facing right now? Like, if I sort of create a ranked list of, like, the big problems that we have to solve as a society, like, building a robot to bake a cake is not on the list, right? So why are they building a robot to bake a cake? And why is everybody so excited about that? And I think, there's really something that we can learn here from the engineers, right? Which is that, like, they solve real problems. Like, they're not necessarily the most important problems in the world, but they're real problems, right? And what do I mean by real? Well, it's sort of like anybody can understand a robot baking a cake, right? It's just a very clear goal, right? I know what it means, and I know when it happens. I can verify it, right? But I also understand that it's hard. Like, I cannot build a robot that can bake a cake, neither can you, right? But, like, these guys can. So it's this sort of, it's anybody can imagine the problem, anybody can verify that the problem has been solved, and everybody can understand that it's hard to do it, right? So that's one reason, one sort of criteria for what I mean by a real problem. Also, it's a problem that in trying to solve the baking the cake problem, it generates a lot of basic science along the way, right? And so they're doing a lot of theorem proving, they're doing a lot of hardware compiler stuff. I mean, it's really, there's some crazy technical stuff going on there. So even though the objective is this sort of, in some sense, trivial thing, there's a lot of non-trivial science being devoted to it. And along the way, maybe they figure out some stuff that does solve a real problem. Maybe they build robots that can also, put out fires and do other kinds of interesting things. The cake in some sense is just a foil to sort of stimulate these other kinds of things. But
along the way, it generates it's exciting. Like people want to, if you say, I'm going to build a robot that's going to bake a cake, it's going to cost $10 million, like someone's going to write you a check for that, okay? Right, so this is, the DARPA grand challenges, other great, when I first heard about the robot, the self-driving vehicle challenge, I was like, what's the point of that? They sort of got these cars that are crashing around in the desert, sort of driving into ditches. I mean, it was the first DARPA, self-driving vehicle grand challenge was a joke, right? I mean, it just was like the Monty Python skit, the 100-meter dash for people with no sense of direction. Like they all sort of run, So this was what the first DARPA grand challenge was like. But now we have, Google has self-driving vehicles, right? Like directly because of that grand challenge, the guys running that program, like with cutting his teeth in that challenge. So there's something incredibly. The engineers have sort of figured out this model of doing science by just picking a problem and just solving it, right? And I wonder, and this is, I guess, the challenge I want to sort of leave us with. Can we do this in social science? Is this just totally incompatible with how social science works? It's certainly incompatible with how social science has worked, right? We have not tried to solve real problems. We have proposed theoretical frameworks. We have investigated empirical puzzles. We have sort of given people mental models to help them organize their thinking about the world. And this is all productive and potentially useful and valid social science, but none of it is like this, right? And I'm asking, are there things that are like the robot problem that we can set for ourselves and say, okay, we're gonna solve this. Give us 10 years and we'll do it. Yes. Yeah, Sid, I think was first.
So one point you sort of just at the beginning you were sort of bemoaning, social science for not making maybe as much progress you might hope. And one question I had for you was, is it a problem with metrics? So as compared to computer science, it's very easy for me to say my algorithm works faster than your algorithm. My algorithm uses less memory than your algorithm. The metric is obvious.
Yeah.
But now, let's say I had a theory that says of how people change their minds, and you have a theory that has about how people change their minds. I don't even know what's the metric now to say mine's better than yours. I'm lost. Is that a key sort of stumbling block?
I mean, that could be true. I think that, almost certainly it's true to some extent that, human problems are just sort of multifaceted, and this is obviously the case in theories of organizations where, people just sort of start from, it's like the blind man and the elephant, like everybody's kind of feeling a different part of the problem and coming up with a different conception. So I think that is absolutely a challenge. What I think is surprising in a way is that we don't even really grapple with that challenge, right? That it's like, yeah, okay, there's this problem that like we have a bit of an apples to oranges comparison here. How do we resolve that, right? Is it not resolvable, right? Let's sort of try to bring let's at least make the effort to force a dialogue between these theories and see, is there anything that one can predict that the other one can't, right? Like, what do we care about? Let's like pick an objective, right? Like that doesn't really sort of happen, right? And I think part of it is that it couldn't have happened for much of history because the data that would have been able to sort of adjudicate was not available. But just because that data is now becoming available doesn't mean that we're going to start doing it. There's a change of mindset that's required as well. Yeah, thanks.
You started by highlighting the lack of consensus and cohesion within social sciences with regard to various issues. And my question is, do we really want any kind of consensus about how to deal with these issues? It seems like we deal in issues that are inherently controversial. The science is informed by different philosophies, and people who are doing the science they want different solutions to the same problem. So it seems that we're dealing in a science that cannot reach a consensus. I think that's healthy in some ways. It gives us different perspectives on similar issues, but That's my approach, at least my perspective.
I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think Sid was actually sort of asking a version of the same thing. And there's an old paper, I think, by Ray Boudon about, like, can sociology be a normal science, right? And I think there's a deep question there, and I don't think we have to resolve it, right? But I think that one way to sort of skirt that issue is to say, okay, well, let's just accept that there'll probably always be some sort of people will come at these issues from different perspectives. But let's try to do something, right? Like, within some domain, let's try to sort of, it can be a limited domain, but like some sort of outcome that we acknowledge that we care about. There's some problem that is hard that matters. And what can we as social scientists say about that problem that is useful? Yeah.
Directly to Ben's point, I certainly agree that there will not this one solution to a social problem, or probably we're not heading to this one theory. But your entry was having 111 or 110 in a certain field is, of course, the other extreme that is quite naturally not just reflecting that we're coming from different ideologies. And I think what we're seeing here is really a reflection. It's bad enough that we are all aiming for these 5 top journals in each of the fields, that you have those 3 in sociology and 5 in economics or whatever. But if you're looking at the journal aim and scope, what do we want to publish? It's basically generally saying we're interested in novel theories. We are interested not in mere replication. We are not the place for just confirmation of what is already out there. And that is a big difference in social science to other sciences, natural sciences, where it's just about the confirmation again and again to make sure that this one holds up. And I think there is an inbuilt mechanism in the journal publications that creates 110 theories on the same thing, because that's the only way to get into the top journals, and not by saying, I'm number 10 to confirm that this is really right. Then you're at the end of the pecking order. And another point, which is a bit related between this gap, where there's so much asking for interdisciplinarity, at least in Scandinavia, where I'm based, most foundations right now are asking for interdisciplinary project proposals. So you're supposed to have these mixed teams. That will create chance to get the money. But there's a silent understanding that once you have the money, you better sort of stay away from each other, because ultimately you've got to go to these top 5, top 3 journals once again, and they're the reviewer, and here we are to be blamed ourselves. We say, what exactly was your target audience? You draw your literature from all sorts of places, but what is this really about? So once you try to do this, you have a very hard time to sell this. So I'd love just to sort of say it's all Elsevier that is sort of killing the way what we are doing, but once Elsevier asked us to be a referee, I think we should have adopt the stuff that we actually don't like and just act in these same stereotypes. So I mean, I don't know. You say
it's sort of very kind of prosaic, but it may be the most difficult problem of all. Is that, like, we can talk all day about what we should be doing, but if none of us has an actual incentive to do it, then we're not going to. And so I agree with you that the way you advance your career as a sociologist is you have a theory with your name on it that you're associated with, and you don't want to just go around and help somebody else get more citations for their theory. But I mean, I don't know what to say except that we have to acknowledge that this is maybe the issue and talk about how to maybe we change the publishing system. Delia is trying to do that. Maybe we change the tenure system. Maybe we do it outside of universities. John.
I certainly wholeheartedly agree with 90% of what you say. Interdisciplinary, pragmatic engineering. I'm all over that. I'm a fan of that. But I want to focus on the 10% that maybe we disagree on. Of course, it comes from the fact that I study Renaissance Florence. So I don't have all of this technology, and I don't have.
You can't solve Renaissance Florence.
There's a totally different data set of archival materials. A lot of the formulas for what you're talking about are just irrelevant. For my sort of data sort of world. But that's not a deep problem. We can just agree to disagree that your data is useful for one thing. So I want to focus on, I think there are deeper issues behind that. There are two deeper issues that maybe I'd like you to talk about. One is what I label the difference between big data and thick data. Okay? So, big data, and I have pretty big data for an historian actually, but thick data is not so much focused on, N, it's focused on reconstructing the context. There's this on the marriage, and this on the business, and there's this on the letters, and this is what art they have in their house, and what an historian is taught to do, is to reconstruct the context of the person, which is really about thickness, the number of entries you have as opposed to the N in question. And that's not to say that this can't be extended. I don't think it's an existential problem necessarily, but it is a practical problem in the following sense that, I go to, quite a few conferences like you did, and like that one we went to together down in NYU. It's like a whole conference about Twitter. Network analysis of Twitter. This is what I call thin data. This is all uber thin data, and it's a very, very popular network science. It's growing. Is this really where I want network analysis to go? Into this uber thin quality. So it's not an existential problem, but it's an incredibly practical problem as far as what I see the field doing. And the second question is going back to you touched on it. Your robot design. I just, I'm with you. The practical engineering approach is very valuable and so forth. But I'm not so optimistic about the scale up. I keep saying, well, how much can I scale up Twitter and understand the rise of capitalism? The big questions. I'm not sure that I could scale it up in any way to understand the rise of capitalism. So I'm just less optimistic than you are about the scaling potential, even if we made it thicker and even if we did this, because there's no temporality in this. We're stuck, with studying the world that the internet has created for us. So there's
John,
two questions.
Right. So John, actually, I think we're actually not in disagreement at all. Like, I think that, I absolutely the thin versus thick distinction, and the Twitter, the emphasis. I think it's very easy to understand why there are so many papers about Twitter. It's the light post problem. Everybody knows this story, right? Like, we're just looking under the light post, right? The data is there, and it's easy to get, and that's why everybody studies Twitter, right? I think any thoughtful person who uses Twitter data would immediately acknowledge your point. The difficult thing is, how do you fix it, right? And I know that Sid is working with an ethnographer already at Mary Gray at Microsoft to try to understand the sort of lived experience of crowd workers, right? So Sid is looking at their online behavior, and then Mary is actually traveling to India and interviewing them in their houses and trying to understand what is the sort of social, cultural, family, economic context that that is generating what we're seeing online, right? I actually think, and it's interesting that there are no ethnographers in the room today.
No.
Oh, there is?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Eric Kleinberg was complaining that ethnographers were not invited to the future.
I picked up on an email that happened to come across my desk.
Right. Well, great.
I feel like I'm crashing, so.
No, well, no, but I actually really think that ethnography is part of this, and this is exactly this point of integrated research design, is that we I don't think we can really make substantive important progress until we actually figure out, well, how does ethnography work with large scale data analysis, right? They're both useful. They both do different things. Neither one on their own is sufficient, right? But maybe they can be coordinated with each other to generate a kind of insight that actually is informative. But that's going to take some work, right? And that's going to have to deal with these incentive issues of how we, it's going to take longer for everybody to figure out how to do that, and the result is probably not going to look like ethnography, and it's not going to look like
sort of computational social science, and so where are we going to publish it, and how is it going to get recognized? But so that's why I think maybe focusing on a real problem, as I'm calling it, might help to sort of cut the Gordian knot. Is that here's the problem that we're trying to solve. Everybody gets excited enough about the problem. Maybe we can sort of set aside these other concerns that we have. I agree that that I don't see how you go from Twitter data to understanding systemic risk in financial systems or the rise of capitalism either. So that's the wrong problem. But so I think part of the criteria has to be how do we, and this is why it's hard, right? What's the version of the robot problem that actually isn't irredeemably trivial, right? That does have. Right, so we had Steve over here first.
Steve can make a comment, but we then have a coffee break. We're running over time.
So just one thing that occurred to me when you were mentioning the robot problem was when I think, as a mathematician, quite outside this world here, from the outside, when we think about spectacular things like the robot making the cake in social science, I think of things like the Stanford prison experiment, Milgram's obedience experiment, Milgram's small world experiment, and all of these, the popular mind is aware of these things and thinks of these as cases where social science actually gave us something that was not trivial, that was not, that was truly counterintuitive, I think, in all three cases. And which in terms of real world impact, just remember Abu Ghraib, which hasn't been that long ago. I don't think the Stanford prison experiment is a bad model for that. It seems like it gave us a lot of insight into what you might expect to happen in circumstances.
Of course,
like
nobody would be allowed to conduct those experiments.
That's right. That's right. Fair enough. But I'm not quite sure what my point is, except one other thing that occurs to me whenever I talk to my insider friends in social science about my admiration for Milgram and his dramatic and even theatrical experiments. I'm told that he didn't do theory, that Milgram was weak in that respect. And I think this is outrageous. These to me look like really spectacular insights into the human condition from work of Zimbardo and Milgram. And to be told they didn't do theory, I just feel like, you must have misplaced priorities if you think that's a valid attack on what those people contributed.
Can I just pile on? Because that was exactly the point I was going to make. Not the one that you meant to make, but that is that really exciting social science research is going to pose profound political and ethical concerns. And I had a robot problem. It was predicting content of redacted text. It met all the criteria you're talking about. It was clear, it was verifiable, it was going to stimulate new science, it was generating excitement, it attracted funding, and that's when our problems began. Because there was a lot of media attention, and then there was a lot of concern about whether we were going to, at the least, be confronting really serious ethical and political problems. And it led to blowback. People dropped out of the project. Some of that funding went away. And so, yes, there are robot problems in the social sciences, but they are really difficult problems.
I have another bullet criteria that I didn't list today is that the awesome problem isn't creepy.
Isn't creepy.
There's a lot of awesome stuff that's totally creepy,
Yes.
right? Like engineering mass behavior change. That would be awesome, right? Like that's a real engineering problem. Like, if you could do that, but it would freak everybody out, right? It's just like, you're like, oh, that's the Nazis, right? So I think there's a lot of, so it's a difficult optimization problem. I'm not suggesting this is easy by any stretch.
You only got one line in your presentation. The social supercollider may pose some ethical issues.
I know. I had like 2 hours to talk, so. But no, you're right. It's a constraint.
Thanks very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.